Thank you everyone for joining us here. My name is Tim Phelps. I'm the Executive Director for TMACC. I thank you for joining us for today's program, Placemaking 2.0. We have three great speakers that will be with us, kind of talking about some of the principles around placemaking and what we need to do as we make a transformation of our streetscapes during this pandemic and as we come out of the pandemic. Today's guest speakers will have Gary Toth. He'll be our primary speaker. Gary has a long-standing background in working with placemaking and bringing it to reality in many communities across the country. Bob, Pento, and Ashwin will be talking about some of the things that PennDOT has done during the pandemic to bring a little bit of ease to the process and how we can work with this coming into this year. I asked that everybody stay on mute during the presentation, and if you're moving about, please stop your video. If you would, in the chat section, please put your questions. John Ewald and I will be monitoring the chat questions, and so we will curate those as we go through the process and ask our various guest speakers on the program. So with that, I'd like to introduce Gary Toth. Gary and I kind of started speaking last fall as we were making some decisions in our communities when we were going through, really the revisiting our communities in the fall, and how long do we keep our streetscapes open? And Gary and I had some great conversations wrapped around that. At various board meetings at TMACC, we were talking with the PennDOT side, and it became very evident that as we came into 2021, that streetscape closures were going to be a thing that is going to be staying with us. I think it's one of the positive things that is coming out of the pandemic. So as I said, Gary has a very robust background in placemaking. He's held some senior positions with various different organizations through his career. And Gary is joining us today. Gary, I'm going to give the floor all to you.
My name is Gary Toth, and I'll talk a little more about my background in a minute. But as we talk about transforming streets during the pandemic, we might ask, what do we transform them into and how do we do it? And that's the focus of my presentation today, right? It's streets and placemaking, why they belong together. So a bit about me. I graduated as an engineer from Stevens Institute of Technology in 1973. And then I went to work for the New Jersey Department of Transportation. And I went to work in an era when there was no thought of streets as places. We were creating streets to move cars around. And I'm very proud of that background, and I lived in that world for 20 or 25, 30 years until around 2000, when we decided that we wanted a different approach, because in New Jersey, and just like Southeast Pennsylvania, we're very densely populated, and it became increasingly difficult to build more roads because of community opposition. And plus, many of our roads were already as big as they could probably get. And, I just think of I-95 when I travel down to Philadelphia all the time. It seems like they've been widening that road for 40 years. So we turned to the Project for Public Spaces when I was at New Jersey DOT around the year 2000 to help us figure out how to engage the community better in deciding what kind of streets we want. And then in 2007, when I left the New Jersey DOT, I went to work for the Project for Public Spaces for 14 years. And now, in addition to my own business, I'm a founding member of something called the Placemakers Guild, which with 5 other people were forming an organization. So the Project for Public Spaces is founded on the work of somebody named William H. White. And he said back in 1960s, that the street is the river of life, the place where we all come together, the pathway to the center. And he did it because he was an early visionary who saw that the engineering and the planning for our streets became all oriented towards moving vehicles, which was a good thing. It helped create a lot of wealth in our country. But he was concerned that every street was being designed that way, as opposed to leaving some streets back to conserve as places. And so as he talked and worked with the Project for Public Spaces on the restoration of the streets, roles, and community building, we realized that transportation before the dawn of the automobile worked side by side with everybody in community building. And the pieces of the community carefully related to each other. And it had to, right? Because if you had to walk to get everywhere, you couldn't find some open space 5 miles out in the countryside and tell everybody to go shopping there, right? Everything had to be close together. Everything had to be synergized, almost like a fine Swiss watch. And before the dawn of the automobile, the street design had to accommodate all users, right? It was economy of space, and spaces had to have multiple uses. And streets were played a critical role in supporting community uses, and they served as public spaces. Lots of things went on on those streets. All right, now my presentation's not moving. There we go. The multi-purpose street lasted until the 1920s, when we fell in love with our automobile. And that's not a bad thing. My automobile got me up here to Vermont, 7 hours away from New Jersey, and I wouldn't want it to have taken 2 days to get up here. And so having a car and having roads to get us there is a great thing. But what happened was, the profession that I came into in the 1970s was geared solely towards building roads. And that was by design, right? In 1956, when the country passed the Interstate Act, right? And we were asked to build 40,000 miles of roads in 20 years. We had to specialize, right? You had to treat it almost like military, focusing in on an objective. And everybody just assumed that the other things like health and social needs and so on would take care of themselves. So community building devolved into silos. And again, it's not the fault of the transportation folks and the engineers, maybe a little bit, but in general, this is what our country wanted. And everything became specialized, architecture, landscape architecture, planning, and everybody devolved into silos. And so in 1973, this is what I was taught, right? Modern transportation planning. You really don't, the only way you think about the community is several levels down. Once you started coming up with alternatives, you started choosing between alternatives based on what their impacts for the community were, impacts the environment, and so on. And the mode was pretty much predetermined. There was 1970, 1980, when I was there, I didn't think much bicycles. I scoffed at it, frankly, because it was like, how are people going to get around New Jersey in a bicycle, right? Or walking, right? You had to use your car. But now we're hankering for a different approach. Particularly the pandemic has highlighted the need to use our streets as places. So what do we do now? So I think we go back to a system of place-based transportation. We don't really have to reinvent the wheel. We did this back in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, understanding how streets fit into the community. Now, this doesn't mean that every street has to serve as a place. I know we still need a lot of our roads to get people around. So the Pennsylvania Turnpike, the New Jersey Turnpike, I-287, I-95, they all need to stay. They all need to stay as streets to get people moving around. But some streets should serve as a place. And so what we need to do is figure out what the recipe is for our communities, right? And how things fit in, and not design our streets with the single-minded, everyone with a high level of service, with a high design speed. Some have to serve as a place. So when I was at the Project for Public Spaces, I worked with the PPS founder, Fred Kent, and we came up with this concept called Streets as Places. And I'm not going to read these elements to you. I'm going to pause for a second and allow you to read it. But this is what we came up with in terms of the characteristics of the place. So I'll go through these one by one. But number one, streets have to have many destinations. And at the Project for Public Spaces, we call this the weekend that we want to go someplace to visit, right? More than likely, it's a place like Doylestown, because it's got many things to do. You don't really even have to decide up front that you want to go to a particular restaurant. You can go in and walk around and stroll around. You can window shop. You can do other things. Look, you can even buy cigars there, and but you can also have many choices on places to eat. So yeah, that's called the Power of 10, multiple destinations. Do you find it around? You know, Philadelphia has it. My hometown of Lambertville has it. Um, Tim took me on a tour virtually of Westchester. Westchester has many things to do. And part of that is that people love it when indoor uses spill outside, right? You walk by and, you know, there's people are selling books. There's many sidewalk cafes. The one on the right is one of my favorite places to visit, Napa Valley. It has amenities, all kinds of amenities, trash cans, seating, and lighting, right? Lighting makes a place exciting to visit at nighttime. And it could be a small rural place like Haley, Idaho, or it could be Larimer Street in Denver, Colorado, or Seattle. Great streets that are places have a sense of enclosure, right? When you're walking down the street, you have a sense that you're in an outdoor room. Urban planners call this the outdoor room feel. It's much more interesting to walk down a street like this, where there's a lot of things going on, than it is. I travel a lot, so a lot of times I find myself out on the edge of a downtown, and I'm walking along a road with giant seas of parking alongside me in front of the big boxes and car dealerships, and it just seems like it takes forever as opposed to walking down a street like Broad Street in Philadelphia. Um, Great streets have a sense of transparency, right? Nobody likes to walk along a continuous blank wall. And so as you walk along, we're constantly peeking in windows to see what is going on. And this is not only good for the pedestrian, it's good for the businesses, right? A lot of times, I mean, how many times did I go down a street like this and all of a sudden, impulse, I saw something, I didn't really need it, but the, the window drew me in and I ended up purchasing something. It's always good to have a sense of identity, right? Rather than many places that I went to that all look the same. If you drop me in blindfolded into the area, teleported me into it, you know, I might not know where I was. But if you teleported to me this street, I would know that I'm in downtown Philadelphia looking at City Hall. Now, not every place has something as iconic as City Hall to identify it, but you do have a sense that you're in a unique town. It has a unique sense of identity, and that the people that were there shaped that. Here's another example in Fort Worth. I've traveled a lot to Fort Worth on business, and Sundance Square is one of the more iconic places around. Great streets as places have intersections and crossings, not just intersections to get vehicles through, but also that accommodate pedestrians and bicyclists. And it has, these are the pedestrian design elements. I'm not going to go over them one by one, but in many streets where the traffic is heavy, you actually need some mid-block crossings, crosswalk treatments, help identify the fact that the pedestrian may end up being there, bicycle accommodations, sometimes textured pavement, a technique increasingly being used on smaller streets is raised crosswalks so that it serves as a speed hump, and it's just an added measure to slow down cars for when people come down. And when cars are going slow and they see a pedestrian, there's an exchange of eye contact between the motorist and the pedestrian. And I find, like in Lambertville, almost every time when somebody's looking into your eyes, they'll stop for you, as opposed to certain roads that I try to cross in Lambertville, where the cars are traveling at 30 or 40 miles an hour, and it won't stop for a number of reasons. Number one, which is it may be unsafe for them, but they are unable to make eye contact. So great intersections help increase that eye contact and slow down car travel to allow it. Great streets, great downtowns, great places have wayfinding. So you can walk and wander around and you can know what's in the town. If you're visiting, in this case, Raleigh, North Carolina for the first time, you really don't have a mental map. So these kind of wayfinding signs help us find our way around. And also note that these signs talk about not miles, not tenths of a mile, 5/10 of a mile. It talks about how long the walk is, because, you know, the average pedestrian can't really translate. They don't understand. They don't have in their head 1 mile is a 20-minute walk. So these kind of type of things say, oh, 16-minute walk, 17 minutes. That helps increase the legibility of an area. And here's another example of wayfinding. So it comes in all shapes and sizes, but in every case, it's very important to creating placemaking. Flexibility. This is something that I think we're going to increasingly desire to use now that we've spent time in the pandemic, right? Spent time in a lockdown. When we couldn't eat inside, then we had to bring our tables outside because it was safer. And so streets, and we patched together ways to accommodate in streets. But years ago, places like Portland, Oregon, created streets up, and this was in Chinatown, and they found that there weren't really many public places within walking distance in Chinatown for the whole festivals and activities. So they actually converted 2 streets to these flexible streets. So you can see on the picture on the left, cars can go down it like any other street during most days. But when they wanted to shut it down, the fact that it had no curbs and other things, other amenities, made it easier to just simply shift. Now, flexibility, infrastructure helps with flexibility, but it's not totally essential. So many of you might know that Lambertville has a Shad Festival every April. This year, they're postponing it to October. But so they quickly come in, they put some wooden horses in, they close down a couple streets, allow vendors to fill the streets like it was a plaza or a park. And here on Bridge Street, which is, they can't shut it down because this is the street that goes across the river into New Hope. So but you can easily convert it into a flexible street by accommodations like wooden horses. And you can see off to the left over there, looks like some big paint cans and with strings and so on. This is another street that's permanently in place, and it's in Boise, Idaho. And this is in the Basque district. And those folks like to have a lot of events. And so the fact that there's no curbs, you can see the different texture of the street, the concrete, the designs on the street make it easy for people to walk across anywhere they want across the street, and for the thing to function as a festival place. So during the pandemic, so how do we do this, right? How do we create streets as places? How do we create flexible streets? How do we do all of this? It doesn't have to be a major capital project, particularly at first. And here in Witherspoon Street in Princeton, which is about a half hour away from me, I was able to go over and have dinner outside. And these are things that the city had around those blocks. They seemed big and daunting, but basically these were things that were readily available. They came out and they offered a high level of protection and comfort to the people eating at the tables. But it doesn't always have to be so forceful, right? Even little things like parklets can help with this. And people love the fact that they could have activities out on the street so much, and that it just made Princeton even more of a destination to come around, that they're now designing a flexible street like the ones you saw in Portland and in Boise, Idaho, so that this could be permanently accommodated as a street that is a place. And this goes back to the principle I was talking about before, that not all streets have to serve as through routes. And Witherspoon Street is a little bit of a through route, but they had multiple parallel streets that can carry the through traffic. And so they were able to minimize the capacity of the street for cars and maximize the capacity for dining and for pedestrians. And so it works. Other ways of quickly doing tactical urbanism, or at the Project for Public Spaces, we used to call this lighter, quicker, cheaper. These things are very inexpensive, and they can actually be picked up. It calms the nerves of the adjacent businesses because they get nervous about a big capital project. You come in, you put something like this in, the businesses thrive. And you could say, look, I could pick this thing up. In fact, in Lambertville, they had a couple parklets that they picked up and moved around testing and finding the best place for these type of things. They did it in Meridian, Idaho, right? And this was a project that I worked on, and they started to convert the street rather quickly. And they put out 3 or 4 of these parklets for about $15,000 total cost, right? And you can see very easily they put down a little structure, a base for it, and then they put a wooden panel on top of it, and they cordoned it off with flower pots. Back in 2011, I went down with Better Blocks Philadelphia, right? And they converted a number of their streets. And this was materials that they used from Home Depot, right? The burlap, you can see the little flowers, tables in there. And they converted a number of their streets like this. Now, this was only a pilot project, a demonstration project. But again, it shows a way of being able to do this quickly and inexpensively and reversibly. Same thing in Cleveland on Rockwell Avenue, where an urban design studio at Kent State came up with this. And they converted, I mean, there's a lot of streets in downtown. There's a lot of excess capacity, 22 hours a day. And they chose one of them that would least affect the vehicular flow. And they created in this case, it was a temporary bike lane that became permanent. That there's paint there that can be easily washed off after 2 or 3 weeks, but they tested it out and everybody thought it was great. And so they moved to make it permanent. New York City, of course, has been doing this for years. Philadelphia followed suit. And again, this was something that calmed the nerves of the adjacent businesses. New York City said to the businesses, look, we put this down in the weekend, right? They put a tacky substance down, they put a sandy substance on top. They moved in some flower pots and they said, let's just try it out, right? And if you don't like it in 2 or 3 weeks, if it really affects your business, then we'll come back in and in another weekend, we'll take it out. And of course, in 99% of these cases in New York City, the businesses said, we love them, and they stayed because they help businesses. Fred Kent used to say, cars don't shop, people shop. And so this brings more people, allows more people to linger, and you get that spontaneous thing of people going in and grabbing something to eat, grabbing a cup of coffee, or spotting something in the shop and going to go buy it. Street painting is another example of ways to calm traffic. And but I talked to the fellow in Portland that was in charge of street painting, and he said, almost as importantly, if not more importantly, street painting creates a sense of community from the neighborhood and or business owners and so on, because they get together and they self-select what it is, what the design will be, and it's usually something that means something to them. And so, in addition to slowing down traffic minimally, Greg said, but it creates a sense of community. In Fort Worth, they had some excess space that was vacant and that the city wasn't really using. And so they came up with this idea of taking in an old panel and creating it into a rotating artist kiosk. And so once a month, different artists would be selected to come in and show their displays and whatever it is, their art, their sculpture. And it's amazing how much this slows down traffic. I often say that humans are the nosiest species on the planet, and just look at what happens on our big roads when you hit a delay and you find out that there really wasn't an accident, it's just rubbernecking. Well, people riding down the street here in Fort Worth, in this case, Magnolia Avenue, they can always stop and look in and slow down to see what's there today. Here's again an example of how you can do things rather quickly. Tactical urbanism in Chicago, painted bulb outs. You can create cultural diversity with this, whether it be with events or street vendors. So I'm going to close now and say that, this is the image that many people have of us engineers and transportation people. But engineers are not bad people, right? We just need, I always often say that engineers are problem solvers. And early on in my career, the problem that I was asked to solve was to move vehicles and goods as quickly as possible. And so now in the 20th century, 21st century, as we desire more streets as places, more things to have outdoor space during the pandemic, give us a different problem to solve. And that problem would be, how do we keep traffic moving and yet make the street comfortable for pedestrians? And which streets are there, right? Not all of our streets, like I said before, need to be designed for throughput. And so let's work side by side with the engineers and say, okay, I want to do this. Which streets can we pick and safely do this? All right, Tim, I'm going to stop my share and turn the mic back to you.
Great, thanks, Gary. Jonathan, if you would bring up, Gary and I talked about one of my trips about 3 years ago. I had the opportunity to go to Barcelona, and they had done a big project there. It's called Super Blocks. I have a couple of photographs that kind of play off of that idea just to share with folks. So this is one section of the super block. The idea behind this was that they closed the majority of the roads down and created really a pedestrian-oriented environment with re-looking at the streetscape itself. Here you can see, paints and streetscape materials being added here. They brought in the big trees in buckets. They created a place for kids to race on, general seating. And then, John, could you change the slide for me, please? There you go. Here's one of the intersections. So they took the intersection, they slowed the traffic down, and kind of in the middle of that roundabout, quote unquote, they put the playground area for that. John, if you can, one more time. Again, they brought in sculptures here. This is near one of the universities, again, creating that streetscape. And John, I think there's one more. And see, you can see how the streetscape coexists with cyclists too. So they brought in the additional shade. They created these parklets, all to kind of reduce that traffic that's there. Before we make a jump, Gary, I do have a couple of questions for you that popped up in the chat. One actually was that focused on the transformation of streets and transit. How, if you've had any experience working with that, and how the transit needs to work within some of those streetscape closures or be adapted around those streetscape closures.
Sure. In transit stops, there's a whole range, as we all know, right? There's low service bus stops to high service bus stops to actual stations. And so if you think about 30th Street Station in Philadelphia, which is a major transit line, right? Out front, they have something called the porch, which they converted. They got rid of 20 or 30 parking spaces. They converted it into a beer garden, outdoor dining, and so on. Inside, they created a lot of shops and destinations inside there, as opposed to the traditional model of the transit stations. The bus stops are mere portals onto the service. So we were calling that portals to places, but it also works for bus stops, right? Smaller bus stops, right? You can commingle different activities or locate your bus stops within the flexibility that the transit provider has as to where to put the bus stop, to put it someplace where, you get off the bus and maybe a coffee shop there. I have a case study from Los Angeles where a bus stop was transformed into by simply creating clearing out the area, taking down a fence, and all of a sudden coffee shops and other things popped up. So yeah, it's just thoughtful design of these things, and thinking of them as potential placemaking triggers and activities.
Then the last question for you right now is dealing with trees in streetscapes and how and utilities work together. I know I showed some examples of how in Barcelona in the super blocks they brought in the trees during the season in the big buckets. Have you encountered this in other locations with trees, with streetscapes, trees, and utilities?
Absolutely. And in fact, trees add a lot to a street. I think you don't need me to tell you that, right? But at New Jersey DOT in the 1990s, leading to our context sensitive solutions movement in the year 2000, lots of folks would ask us about that. And at first, the engineers are like, "Oh no, trees and cars don't mix." But when we looked into the Green Book, the design manual for roadway engineering, we found out that on a 25-mile-an-hour street with curbs, the trees can be placed within 1.5 feet of the street. And the basic reason for that 1.5 foot offset is not because of the cars. It's because when you park a car and you want to open a door, right, you needed some space to open the door. So yeah, I'm a big advocate of trees, and I did experience in New Jersey DOT some initial resistance from us folks, us engineers, to doing it. But once we actually, somebody gave us a problem to solve of let's make the community better, we found out that there's a time and a place for trees on many low speed streets.
Great. Thank you, Gary. At this time, we're going to transition over to some of the things that PennDOT has worked on. We do have a presentation from Bob Pento and Ashwin Patel. Bob's going to open up and talk about some of the work that he's done at the central office for the whole state, and then Ashwin is going to address some of the opportunities and issues that came out of the pandemic here locally in Chester County. And with that, it is all yours, Bob.
All right, thank you. And Gary, thanks so much for those very interesting presentation. And again, like to think of myself as a recovering engineer. So so it's been for all of us a very interesting year, and a lot of lessons learned. And I think as part of this, we're going to share some of those with you. So the focus really is kind of how we've adapted our special event permit process for use during the pandemic, as these kind of community needs arose, and kind of how we had to make some policy changes, and kind of what we've learned from that experience. So what I wanted to start with, and many of you are probably aware of this portion of our regulation under Title 67 that gives PennDOT the authority, and local municipalities the authority, to close roadways or approve temporary traffic restrictions specifically for processions, assemblages, and special activities. And those are defined in the regulation as to kind of what those specifically mean. But typically these are parades, these are community festivals, these are activities that are temporary in nature typically, and are going to impact the state roadway. There's some very specific requirements that are called out in the regulation that need to be put in place. A couple years ago, we adapted this process, and we used this process to approve film shoot requests when a studio wants to use a portion of a roadway for a film shoot, and there's going to be an impact on traffic. So this is really primary focus is to ensure that there's adequate safety and traffic control in place. If there's a need for a detour during the event, if that's put in place. There's a requirement in the regulation for indemnification, of course, for the Commonwealth and for PennDOT. When we're issuing these permits, we're essentially turning over the operation of that section of the roadway to the event sponsor. And so that's a requirement that is in place. And again, the sponsors for these or applicants for the permit could either be the municipality, or you could have a private sponsor, a business, or some local nonprofit, whatever the case may be. Someone wants to approval to use state routes as part of a 5K run. Those are some examples, and but municipal approval is always required. So this is just some of you may have seen before. This is available on PennDOT's website, and I'm going to have a slide at the end of this that has a number of links to various resources, including a link to this application form. So the TE300 is the form that applicants would use to complete and submit to their local engineering district office for approval for that special event. And again, under the regulation, we're approving the closure or partial closure of the roadway itself. We're not approving the event. We're approving the use of the roadway. So just some of the changes that we put in place during this crazy year. We, as the governor and the Department of Health, and even at the federal level, we're issuing guidance, ever-changing guidance on communities, crowd gathering restrictions, indoor and outdoor restrictions on gathering size limits. We needed to ensure that when we were approving some type of activity within our right-of-way, we weren't inadvertently approving some activity that on its face wasn't in compliance with those restrictions. So we needed to ensure that in any of those applicants that they were complying with that guidance, they weren't exceeding gathering limits. So really to promote some consistency, we centralized the review of these. These typically were always reviewed and approved at the district office, and I believe that will return. The district offices really are the folks that do the bulk of the work on working with the applicants, but we had to take a step to centralize these reviews. And in doing so, became more aware of this kind of growing need from communities to find ways to use their right-of-way, sometimes state right-of-way, for business recovery. And again, outdoor dining and retail activities. Probably the first that really we became aware of it in Harrisburg was Philadelphia issuing their outdoor dining guidelines document. It's very detailed and really kind of formalized the creation of streeteries and kind of criteria for how those are going to be established. One of our main focuses was we needed to make sure that we were maintaining traffic safety during these non-highway uses, and ensure that was going to make sure that space was safer for everyone, motorists as well as pedestrians, bicyclists. When we became aware of this and we're doing some research on, okay, how could we approve these types of uses? In working over on the traffic operations side, we weren't as aware of some of the federal requirements regarding the use of right-of-way. That a lot of this typical policy falls over in the other side of the house in our right-of-way division, but we became aware that these non-highway uses of federal aid right-of-way, if this use would happen to be on a federal aid route, there's some requirements associated with that on the federal level, and one of which is the collection of fair market value lease or a fee for that non-highway use on federal aid routes. Now there are opportunities to request exemptions from that for social, environmental, or economic purposes, but there is a requirement, and there is a requirement for federal highway approval. So we, in making sure that we had a method and a process to approve those uses, we made a determination we were going to utilize our special event permit process to approve these types of uses and develop a policy around that. So with discussions with FHWA, it was clear that they would consider a fair market value waiver essentially on a case-by-case basis. They wouldn't issue a blanket waiver that at the state level, we could just give blanket approval for these uses, these non-highway uses. We still needed to go to them for approval on a case-by-case basis. And again, that federal requirement also applies to locally owned federal aid routes. So we're not just talking about state routes. If you have a local street that's on the federal aid network, national highway system, that federal requirement applies as well. So as I mentioned, there was policy that we had developed. Um, it, in looking at the three potential use cases, again, this was kind of our first attempt at this. I'm sure this is going to evolve over time, as you know, as you all have said, this is not going to go away post-pandemic. I'd expect that communities are going to continue to pursue this, and it's a good thing. And so we just need to make sure we have a process in place to make sure that we can get all of our approvals in place, and safety is maintained. So again, the three use cases that we addressed in this initial policy were situations where the pedestrians are in the parking lane. And the activity itself is in the sidewalk. And again, you know, we're redirecting pedestrians off of the sidewalk into the parking lane to accommodate whether it's retail activity or outdoor seating on the sidewalk itself. Situation where the parking lane is closed for the activity. And again, this traditionally would be what would be considered essentially a parklet, but in these situations, we're actually having now commercial activities happening and restaurants seating people and having table service in that location. And then the third being one or more travel lanes actually closed for the retail activity, the commercial activity. And so the policy was put in place to address that. It set in place some high level requirements for flexibility. So to ensure that there's safety measures that are in place, but it really kind of leaves it open for designers to come up with some unique, innovative approaches to make the areas more attractive, but ensuring that, you know, safety is maintained for all the users. And so to apply for this type of use, there's a requirement for the special event permit application, a traffic safety plan, kind of over and above what you would typically use for a special event permit application is also required. And to satisfy the federal requirement, an environmental categorical exclusion form. And that all of that package itself is what we use to submit to the Federal Highway Administration if this use would be on a federal aid route. So the one example that we can point to was the closure of Gay Street, I think a 4-block section of Gay Street in Westchester. And these are some photos just to show ultimately kind of what Westchester was able to put in place. Engineering District 6 worked closely with Westchester to kind of follow the requirements of that policy, put the application together, and that was ultimately approved by Federal Highway. And this was put in place for, I'm trying to recall if it was early summer, late spring, by the time Westchester was able to get this in place, and that continued in through the fall. And I believe they intend to open that back up again this spring. So, and kind of was generally seen as a success. And but again, as traffic engineers, this was kind of a new thing for us. But again, education is a good thing, and I'd expect that we're going to see more and more of this. So with that, I'm going to hand this off to Ashwin Patel from Engineering District 6, just to kind of give us a little his perspective from the Engineering District.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Yeah, so like you mentioned, you know, we were approached by Westchester Borough last year to close 4 blocks of Gay Streets to allow for like outdoor dining and create some sort of a pedestrian plaza where outdoor retail activity can take place. So with that, I guess one of the key takeaways from that experience is that early coordination and communication is a key to avoid any delays as there are multiple levels of approval needed. And it would take typically like 2 to 4 weeks. And like Bob mentioned, you know, now we need to get the approval from central office as well as from FHWA, Federal Highway Administration. So it was determined that for full or partial closure of state highway or a local federal aid route, following documents needs to be submitted, especially when permit in the name of the local municipality with the certificate of insurance. And like Bob mentioned earlier, we would also need a traffic management plan which outlines the impact to traffic operation and how we're going to mitigate those impacts. how is the full and partial closure being accomplished, whether we need the detour plan, impact to the emergency service providers, and how the access will be maintained to provide for local deliveries, and how are the patrons being protected. And the third thing we probably will need is the COVID-19 safety plan. As like Bob mentioned, these gathering size limits are ever-changing thing, and there is a occupancy calculation worksheet that was put together by central office that needs to be submitted. And the last thing is the categorical exclusion form to request fair market value waiver, and it has to be approved by FHWA. So next slide, Bob. One of the things that we learned earlier is that we have to be mindful for lead time for road closure detour signs and barriers for the supplier, because it takes time to procure that material. So the agency or the local municipality need to be planned accordingly to procure those materials. Communicate the duration of closure to the motoring public to avoid confusion and delays. We were on site while they were setting the barricades to close gay streets, and there were some issues that we encountered. We had to accommodate for pedestrian access. We need to move some things around to maintain open crosswalks and things like that. And we need to continue the coordination post implementation to address any issues that may have come up. One of the issues that we came across on the detour route along Chestnut Street that we need to accommodate and make some changes as we found them out. So I guess with that, Bob, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Ashwin. So that really kind of wraps up the slides that we had prepared, kind of trying to give a high level overview. But again, as I said, these are the some links to resources. They should be in the PDF that I think was going to be shared with everyone. To the regulation itself, we put together a guidance document on special event, the process for applying for a special event permit, and it speaks a little to this process for these non-highway uses. But again, we're really encouraging the applicants work with your engineering district. You know, they're familiar with the policy. Again, this is fairly new for us, but you know, they would be your first step and resource to work through kind of what the process is and what we're going to need to be able to go through the application process. The link to the form itself. Philadelphia's outdoor dining guidelines document, I think, is a great resource. They put a lot of time into thinking about how safety can be maintained for these types of outdoor uses. And another resource is a link to, if you're unsure if a particular route is on the federal aid network, we have a GIS online map that you can check to determine if the Federal Highway Administration needs to be involved. And again, that waiver process, that's just for federal aid routes. We recognize there's probably other state routes that the community may be interested in pursuing for one of these uses. You know, we wouldn't need to go through that additional step for the federal waiver if it's for one of those routes. I think one thing I would want to add as part of that policy, I think I didn't have in the slides here, we want those requests to actually come from the municipality. Again, special event permits can be either a municipal or a private sponsor on the application, but for these non-highway uses, we really want to make sure the municipality's on board. It's something they approve of. They have their buy-in. So for now, under this initial policy, we want the municipality to be submitting those applications. They may be on behalf of a business, but we want to make sure that the municipality is bought in and has approved that use. So with that, if there are any, Tim, I'm not sure if at this point we want to take any questions.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Bob
Sure.
and Ashwin. And folks, please put your questions in the comment area. John and I will then curate those questions. I have one for you, Bob, and then one for Ashwin, and I'll ask both of you the questions here that you can respond back to back. Bob, is there an opportunity to amend the application form, the TE 300, that would include a box that would create a checkoff for transit routes, so that the transit provider in the state, wherever it is in that community, would be notified of any road closure before it actually happens? And then my question to Ashwin is the review of the signage for road closure. I know that in some cases, folks feel that there was redundant signage. I know that this is important, but is there going to be a review of what road signage is appropriate so it's not extreme?
Yeah, I guess the short answer to that first question is yes. Where there's been kind of several things that we've learned in this last year in kind of taking a look at our special event permit process. And so I kind of have a laundry list of updates that I want to make to the form, just mainly for clarification. But I think that's a good point. And if there's if that's something that's that type of coordination is being overlooked now, I think that would be a good add. So I took a note here to add that to my list. So
Great. And then Ashwin on the signage.
Yeah, so Tim, we actually got feedback from Westchester Borough as to there were numerous number of signs that wouldn't be needed or required, since Gay Street was like a one-way going westbound. So in the recent resubmission, we had worked with the engineer for the borough to reduce the number of signs that we need to put out there for the closure.
Great, great. I have two additional questions for both of you guys. Could you clarify the fair market valuation form, and then clarify what non-state federal aid route actually means?
sure. So regarding the valuation for the fair market value, this is essentially something that on the traffic operations side we learned of this year as these requests came up, because this type of commercial use in the right of way is not something that previously we had considered or approved under a special event permit. But it was determined that the special event permit was the kind of the best mechanism to approve those uses. So kind of brought to our attention this federal requirement for the collection of fair market value. Again, in the CFR, the federal government doesn't define or doesn't require a specific methodology that the transportation agency used to determine that value. So on the right-of-way side, when we have these other kind of more typical uses, when like the infield of an interchange or under a bridge, some commercial activity or entity wants to use that right-of-way. On the right-of-way side of the house, they have a process, and they go through an appraisal, and they determine that fair market value fee, and there's a process to charge that. This isn't something that we have in place for under special event permit process. So the short answer is we're working on a process for that right now, as to kind of a simple methodology as to how we would determine what that cost would be, and frankly, in what instances we actually think it's reasonable and feasible to charge that fee. This is something that we still need to work out with the Federal Highway Administration. At this point, we've only approved one, and a waiver from that requirement to collect that fee has been approved. But going forward, we'd expect that there'll be instances when that waiver, there's an activity that's happening, but we're not during the pandemic, and it wouldn't meet the eligibility requirements for the social or economic waiver need under the federal rule. So we're putting a policy together now on what would be those instances when we would intend to charge the fair market value fee versus when we wouldn't. And then in the instance when we would, what would be the method that we would determine what that value would be. And frankly, we are looking at some of the processes that the city of Philadelphia already has in place for their permit fees for their uses of parking spaces and sidewalk spaces as a bit of an example, as well as some other things going on nationally. So hope that answers the question.
The second question was the clarity what the non-state Fed aid route means.
Sure. There are many more than I expected, actually, streets within the Commonwealth that are not on the state route network. They're not state owned or maintained, so they're local streets, but they are on the federal aid network. They were at some point, must have been there was federal dollars involved in their initial construction, establishing them, federal dollars involved in their maintenance, and so they're considered federal aid routes, and they would fall under that eligibility requirement in the CFR. These would be so these would be many of these are in the city of Philadelphia. They're in urban areas, some in non-urban areas. So there's more than I expected, actually, because this wasn't something that I had really had been involved in before. So the point was that those routes are actually would still fall under that eligibility under the CFR for the fair market value collection.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Bob and Ashwin, for your presentation. It was tremendous. I think it gave some of our engineering firms and our municipalities some insight into what's coming down the pike here. So thank you very much.
Sure.
Gary, any closing words from you?
No, I think we covered it all. I think that well, let me say this. I think what the process that Bob and Ashwin talked about. The average person might say that there's a series of regulations in my way, but I think what we understand as engineers and we try to convey to the community is that those are there for a reason, right? I mean, when Bob was talking about the federal aid regulations, right? Just envision that this was the federal aid acts where the funding came to the states was created by a bunch of people in Washington, right? And they covered the whole universe of different kinds of roads. And so when these rules were put into place, they weren't thinking specifically of Witherspoon Street or Gay Street in Westchester. They didn't know, right? And so they were put in place because there was an anticipation of different questions that might be asked. So like on Witherspoon Street in Princeton, not all the merchants were for that, right? It took out 6 or 7 parking spaces. And in one in particular, a coffee shop, found out that it really hurt their business, right? So these things are there to make sure you touch all bases. They may seem cumbersome, but it's, as long as, and it sounds like PennDOT is working to try to maximize the flexibility and demystify all of this. I think it works, but it's not really PennDOT or New Jersey DOT or the city engineer of Princeton being too meticulous. It's just there for due process.
Great, thank you so much, Gary, for that.
Tim, I would just add that Federal Highway has been great to work with, and they essentially they've been very flexible, and I think they fully understand that this is a growing need around the country, and they're very willing to work with departments of transportation on processes that make sense. So I don't want to give the impression that we've got some insurmountable hurdles here. I think it's a good opportunity to work collaboratively.
And I want to add, let me add this about PennDOT, right? PennDOT, I've worked a lot with PennDOT. Bob, you may remember the Smart Transportation Guide for Pennsylvania and New Jersey, right? And I worked with them on that, and I've been following ever since. I still talk to some of the people. I find them one of the more flexible transportation departments in the country. Now, I know that doesn't mean all the time. PennDOT's a big place, and there's engineers. I think you have 12 or 16 districts, right? And so every so often you'll run into somebody that's a little bit of a stickler. but PennDOT has this program called PennDOT Connects that former Commissioner Leslie Richards put into place, and PennDOT Connects says that every time they come into a community, they want to leave the community better than they left it, not just move cars. So, but there are rules and regulations and issues, like if you go into a town, not all the time is everybody behind something. So yeah, but I want to give some kudos to PennDOT, even though I'm sure, like the New Jersey DOT did this, Bob. We frustrated people sometimes, and I had some design engineers that I had to work with where I had to buy them a 6-pack of beer, bring back from Vermont, right, and say, look, just relax on those trees in Princeton, right? So we're not all perfect, but in general, I think PennDOT is doing a great job.
Thank you. Well, we've come to the magical hour. We've had a great conversation, and there's some great comments that have been posted in the chat here directly to me. So thank you for everybody joining us. I do want to give a plug to DVRPC, and she actually is on the call. Betsy Masteglio is actually doing a presentation for the Breaking Ground Conference. Ours will be on May 24th. And the reason why I say ours is she has invited me to participate with her. We are going to be discussing rethinking streets for people. And so we're going to be talking about some of the technical urban projects that have gone on around the region just prior to the pandemic and during the post-pandemic here that we're planning, so that we can revision our streets. So please join DVRPC and watch for that registration when it comes up for a Breaking Ground Conference. With that, thank you very much to all of our speakers, very insightful to what we have. Placemaking has become so important in our lives now as we're trying to find new ways to connect. We are humans. We like to be together. We like to gather together. We just need to find the safe ways to do that. Our downtowns are being found again, whether it is in a Phoenixville or a Westchester or an Oxford or a Media or a downtown Malvern. We have great classic towns that are around here. So with that, thank you, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you at our next presentation. Be well, be safe. Thanks, everyone.